One. So in this video, I'm going to be a little bit different from my other videos. I try not to talk about politics that much because I think there's so much more that we have in common than like our divisions that are. But I feel that like it's important to know now that these divisions that we have between us, it's there's been a confusion about who's leading this division, and it's important to know now, like we're in eclipse season right now and a lot is being revealed. And what prompted this video for me is I throughout the 2010s when I was on Twitter, I would often be asked about to show my proof about like this thing called the Southern Strategy, which was like the GOP, like Republican Party in USA, their strategy to get white Southern men, because at that time, like the parties switched. Like it used to be Republicans, like for example, you probably heard of Abraham Lincoln being the Republican Party being the party of Lincoln. But the thing is, it switched around 1964, the Civil Rights Act, because the racist white people just wanted segregation, whereas the Civil Rights Act gave African Americans and other minorities and like so many more rights towards equality. Because ultimately, it's only one side that wants to restrict. They talk about liberty, but that liberty is not for all. It's for exclusive few. And anyways, so without further ado, I do want to talk about the Southern Strategy. Like, let me read this chapter here. This is from Cenk Uygur, Justice is Coming. I highly recommend you get this book because he goes into details behind the scenes, and it's not crazy conspiracy theories. It's actual reality that they use against us, and it's important that we be informed. So let me read this chapter on the Southern Strategy. The Republicans. This is chapter 3. Republicans were not always the party of hate. In the beginning, they were the good guys. They were, in fact, the progressives. You know who really, really expanded the circle of liberty? Abraham Lincoln. But when present-day Republicans call themselves the party of Lincoln, that's unintentionally funny. Now, here's what no one else in the media dares to say, but is obviously true. When someone tells you that the Republicans are the party of Lincoln, they are either completely ignorant of all politics or they're lying to you on purpose. But our media never has the courage to call out Republicans for their obvious tricks and lies. So if Lincoln was in fact a Republican, how can it be a lie to say that they are the party of Lincoln? Because the parties switched positions massively and unmistakably, especially on the issue of race. Everyone who follows politics, even minimally, knows that. There is a clear reason they switched in a defining moment when it happened: the Southern Strategy. The parties switched places on race when Lyndon Johnson bullied, cajoled, and convinced his party, which was filled with Dixiecrats, racists in the South who hated that the Republican Party freed the slaves, to vote for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. This infuriated racist voters in the South, so when Johnson declined to run for president in 1968, Richard Nixon and his allies came up with a strategy that was explicitly racist, meant to pick up those votes for the Republican Party so that they could win that election and others to follow on national, state, and local levels. It's called the Southern Strategy. Everyone in politics knows it. Everyone knows the entire point of the strategy was and is racism. Everyone is aware that it was a potential calculation. But finish the thought. What was that calculation? Nixon and his team concluded that the Republican Party would pick up more votes and have a better chance of winning the Electoral College if it became clearly the more racist party. The Southern Strategy was the original identity politics. You could tell from his White House tapes how racist Nixon was personally, but this wasn't about that. This was just a strategy, an active decision that Republicans could win the South if they attacked the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement. If the GOP became the party of hate instead of the party of Lincoln, it would get more votes and be able to hold on to power more effectively. I've never seen anyone in politics dispute that. In fact, two former heads of the RNC, Ken Mehlman and Michael Steele, have both acknowledged the racism implicit in the Southern strategy and have apologized for it. But during the Trump years, the GOP went back to that same well, and it turns out it still wasn't dry. Republicans did not appeal to the South by endlessly talking about how much they liked peach cobbler. They did it by opposing every reform meant to end discrimination. Literally everyone in the media knows this. Yet the media never share with their readers or viewers that the Republican Party made an active decision to become racist. It wasn't even that the tide of history took them there. It was that the awful people running the Republican Party decided racism was a better political strategy. And they have stayed on that course ever since. Unfortunately, they were right. This strategy was depressingly effective for a very long time. Part of the reason it worked so well was that there was no backlash against or opprobrium for the party that chose to be racist. The media would refer to the Southern strategy, but never finish the thought. Hey, America, the Republican Party is the racist party. Oh God, we would not want to offend the racists. Republican voters have been trained to believe in lies, such as the Southern strategy is about Southern culture. They never clarify which part of the culture they're referring to outside of the racism. Is it the grits that got them all those votes? In a sense, Republicans have been believing ridiculous conspiracy theories such as that the Civil War was not about slavery for decades now. For a party that's delusional, was it that surprising that Donald Trump got them to believe complete absurdities? That's what the press and the Democrats never understood about the appeal of Donald Trump to Republican voters. They didn't mind the lies. They wanted to be lied to. They wanted to be told that they were still special, that their race made them better than others, and that they deserved to have power forever just because of who they are. They needed that sense of unearned entitlement. And if you're looking for someone to tell you lies, who better than the biggest liar and con man in the country? Trump will tell you any lie you need to hear to get what he wants out of the deal. His ability to lie at that scale was not the bug, it was the feature. But this agreed upon national fiction was not just for Trump or Republicans. In order for the advertisers and the media companies to be happy and profitable, they too had to make an active decision. They had to ignore the racist elephant in the room. They did not want to offend their viewers, many of whom wanted to be against civil rights but not be called racists. I was a Republican growing up. I had to find out on my own that Republicans were racists. The media lied to me very actively by omitting this very relevant fact. If, when my family came to this country, someone had explained to us what the Republican Party did and what its strategy was, we would have never joined it. But the press was too cowardly and greedy to tell the clear, unvarnished truth. Because the press never reported on the obvious lies of the Republican Party, we wound up voting for people who based most of their ideology and political strategy on being racists, oftentimes against people like me and my family. Unsurprisingly, black folks in this country eventually got the memo about the Republican Party. They did not need the media to tell them anything because those racist policies affected their daily lives. It was largely white folks who never got the memo. Some would have been discomforted or made angry. Some, however, would have welcomed the information, but since it never touched their lives and the press covered it up, they never knew they were voting for racists their whole lives. So you should not give up on all Republicans. All of them have also been lied to, as I was. Believe it or not, many have no idea what their party stands for. For example, if the entire media were ever honest about the Republican Party's true intentions to get people to vote for tax cuts and for the rich, that's really all they're really, that is their true intention. It's just tax cuts for corporations and the worst people in society. For example, if the entire media were ever honest about the Republican Party's true intentions to get people to vote for tax cuts for the rich, they would immediately lose half their voters. In the old days, mainstream media would debate whether giving all the money to the rich was a good idea, with serious discussions of supply-side economics and the Laffer curve, most appropriately titled curve ever. The idea that you give all the breaks to the rich because a tiny amount will trickle down to the rest of us is laughable. Think about that. For decades, the most predominant economic idea in politics was to help the average American by giving everything to the rich. That's an idea you're supposed to debate, but the mainstream media did not want to offend the powerful by pointing out that this was an obvious sham. So they earnestly debated it for decades. That gave the idea enough legitimacy to provide cover for endless tax cuts that led to trillions in wealth redistribution to the top. This is what passes for journalism in America. And now the right-wing media have become the greatest defenders of the rich by creating every cultural distraction you can think of to make sure Republican voters do not realize the robbery that's happening in the background. While Tucker Carlson was having you debate the gender of Mr. Potato Head, the GOP robbed the national treasury of another $2 trillion in the form of Trump tax cuts. And again, half the Republican voters never even noticed. The truest thing Hillary Clinton ever said was her famous line on the deplorables. You know, to be grossly generalistic, you could put half of Trump's supporter into what I call the basket of deplorables, right? The racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. And unfortunately, there are people like that. And he has lifted them up. But that other basket of people who are people who feel that the government has let them down, nobody cares about them. Nobody worries about what happens to their lives and their futures. And they are just desperate for change. It doesn't really even matter where it comes from. They don't buy everything he says, but he seems to hold out some hope that their lives will be different. The media often report on the first part of the statement, but ignore the second half. As you can see here, I pull no punches on Republicans. I'm happy to take them on and fight them just as viciously as they fight us. But half of them are redeemable, if we could ever get them to listen to something outside of right-wing or mainstream media. And this is why it's so important. If you have friends that are just like on Rumble, or we need to talk to each other about this stuff, because we all want to live our lives as freely as possible, and we all want to live well, and we all want healthy communities, right? So, I mean, it's just unfortunate that the money that goes into these parties, like the Republican Party, is made to brainwash you into thinking that there's divisiveness, because that lets them win. But then ultimately, like even with racism in society, like they're the ones that are winning. And this is the things that we need to call it, because it's clear that we can make a difference through actually coming together and voting. And I think it's just a very important message, because often what I've found is that the bad people have all the, they react quickly, and there's that saying that, a truth will stand, whereas all these other lies will kind of go away. And all these other lies, the reason why is because the other lies fight themselves in this like chaotic, like short-term battle, whereas the truth just remains. So I kind of feel like that's going on right now too in the world with this eclipse season. But anyways, let me continue. Today, things have changed at least a little bit, because progressive voices are stronger and louder. We are not letting the press bully us into silence. In the past, mainstream media would call you a radical and say you were on the fringes if you openly talked about how racist America was. A lot of people in the press will still be scandalized by this as we speak. They will think it's outrageous to say the modern Republican Party's defining characteristic is racism. They would never say that, even though they all know what the Southern strategy is. At this point, protecting the feelings of Republicans is built into their DNA. But with progressives fighting back and the demographic shift in this country, we're going to find out soon if the clock is finally going to run out on the Southern strategy. It looked for a while as though the clock had already struck midnight, but Trump reset the clock in a completely unexpected way. He did not just bring racism back, he made it popular again. Now, are all present-day Republicans racist? No. As I just told you, many of them have no idea what's going on. And there are other factors that could affect your decision to be a Republican. For example, you could be greedy. One of the few demographic categories Trump won in 2020 was people making over $100,000. This is surprising because he got clobbered among well-educated voters who tend to be wealthier. But one force was strong enough to compel even educated people to vote for the obvious con man: greed. Remember, the point of the Republican Party for at least the last century has been to get rich people everything they wanted. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, didn't you just tell me that the point of the Republican Party was to be racist? No, that's their strategy for getting more votes, but that's not their objective. Racism is the tool, greed is the goal. The Republican Party's slogan should be, come for the racism, stay for the tax cuts. Let me read that again. The Republican Party's slogan should be "Come for the racism, stay for the tax cuts." The whole point of getting more votes is so that they can pass more bills to help rich people. How do I know? Because that's almost the only thing they ever do. Reagan passed huge tax cuts that funneled trillions to the wealthy. To give you a sense of how large the Reagan tax cuts actually were, the Trump tax cuts gave away $1.9 trillion and were the size of 0.9% of our gross domestic product. Reagan's 1981 tax cut alone was the size of 2.89% of our GDP, almost 3 times the size of the Trump tax cuts. Then he did another round of tax cuts in the 1986 that reduced the top rate from 70% when he came into office all the way down to 28% when he left. So that's a crazy number, right? Let me read that again. Then he did another round of tax cuts in 1986 that reduced the top rate from 70% when he came into office all the way down to 28% when he left. Not to be outdone, George W. Bush passed $5.6 trillion in tax cuts, the lion's share going to the wealthy, as usual. That was the amount the Bush tax cuts cost just between 2001 and 2018, and the costs keep mounting as we speak. To be fair, Barack Obama made those tax cuts far more expensive by rendering them permanent, and that deal was negotiated for him by his Vice President Joe Biden. Then Trump passed another $2 trillion in tax cuts for the wealthy. You see a pattern? Well, if you don't, you have problems with your vision and probably live in Washington. Here's one more for you, the exception that proves the rule. George H.W. Bush said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." But since the deficit was in horrible shape and it was clearly the patriotic thing to do to rescue the country, he was forced to raise taxes. Republicans hated him for it. They immediately abandoned him, and he lost the next election. They rejected him because he forgot the whole point of the party. As Trump would put it, patriotism is for suckers and losers. The GOP donors and power brokers screamed in unison, "Give us the goddamn money," and chased him out of town. If you're a right-winger, there might be other reasons you like the Republican Party, but even you know the party is for the rich. In fact, it's a minor miracle that a party that for over a century has been serving only a tiny percentage of the country has been so successful in a democracy. It's as if a party set up to serve Asian Americans exclusively winning a majority in most elections. That makes no sense, except Asian Americans are 5% of the country. The super rich are just 1%. So how do they do it? Well, they've got to trick you into voting for them. We already discussed one way to do that, racism. And think about how perfect that is. If you're poor, you might already have class resentment, so they just have to misdirect it a little. This is the oldest trick in the book. Don't look up, look down. Then you sprinkle in envy, the most toxic of all human emotions, and provide the answer. It's the others who are causing all your problems. You're better than them. Well, how do you keep them down to make sure you stay better than them? Racism? Racism is how you make sure you stay better than them. Perfect. That way, even if some minorities are more successful than you, you rest easy with the comforting thought that they can never be better than you by definition because of their race. LeBron James had the N-word spray painted onto his $20 million mansion in Los Angeles. Somebody wanted to teach him a lesson. No matter how much fame, success, or money you have, I still get to feel better by putting you in your place. Remember the controversy during Obama's first term about Harvard professor Henry Louis Gates? Cops harassed him on his own porch and arrested him for disorderly conduct for breaking into his own home. Gates was a public figure, well known in Boston and one of the most respected professors in the country. They put him in his place. In his recent book, President Obama explained that when he made a mild defense of Gates, it cost him more white voters than anything else he had ever done. That's pretty insane. There's a reason why Republicans keep going back to the well on racial resentment. It works. In the Gates incident, only 29% of white respondents thought the arresting officer had acted stupidly. But a stunning 58% of white respondents thought it was Professor Gates who had acted stupidly. Obama's approval ratings declined precipitously because he thought it was wrong to arrest the black professor for entering his own house. But race and greed are not the only things in the toxic Republican stew. Perhaps their largest weapon is religion. It does not matter what else we do or how we rob you blind, because we are the party of God. By the way, Hezbollah is also the party of God. That's what Hezbollah means in Arabic. They're the folks who bombed our Marines in Lebanon in 1983, for God, of course, among hundreds of other bombings. Whenever God talks to anybody, he apparently only tells them to bomb things. George W. Bush once told the French president that he wanted to bomb Iraq because he was concerned about Gog and Magog at work there, according to his interpretation of the Bible. To be fair, God also seems to be asking people to cut taxes for the rich on a pretty regular basis. I thought Jesus said to turn the other cheek, not to bomb other people or invade their countries. And if you actually read the Bible or chapter 2 of this book, you would know that Jesus wanted the rich to give away all their money, all of it, to the poor. No mention of cutting the capital gains tax in the New Testament. I double-checked. Since the teachings of Jesus Christ are diametrically opposed to right-wing ideology, but the GOP needs to use religion to trick people into voting for it, what do the Republicans need? A magic elixir that can solve all their problems, and they found it in abortion. The biggest lie of all. There are two critical facts you have to know about the abortion issue. One is that the people who run the Republican Party have never actually cared about abortion. It was a callous strategy to use religious people as fodder for their political ambitions. The idea was to get people angry about one particular moral issue, but never fix it, and keep dangling that carrot over their heads so that they keep voting for your interests. Otherwise, there are not enough rich people to win elections. This phenomenon is why Republican politicians panicked a little bit when Roe was overturned in 2022. There goes their carrot. When asked if the GOP would call for a national ban on abortion, now that it could, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said, "Most of the members of my conference prefer that this be dealt with at the state level." All of a sudden, McConnell is shy and reserved. He never hesitates when there's a war to start or tax cuts to be passed, but when they finally have the one policy they pretend to care about the most at their fingertips, he doesn't want to act on the national level. These guys are so obvious. Republicans were afraid of losing their foot soldiers. They need an army to win elections. An unthinking army that would take their word on faith alone. Aha! Who forms their worldview based on faith alone? Religious folks. Target acquired. It's kind of like, I'll probably make another video about this, about like in the spiritual community, the right targeted the spiritual and astrology community. That's why I'm so aware of like all these stupid conspiracy theories, because that's what they spent their money towards, is like, because right now people have like a social media addiction and like Neptune's and Pisces. So it makes it like easier to lull them into like their side when they have like these really bad political agendas, but then they like just, it comes off so soft, like, oh, anyways, I'll get to that later. Republicans were afraid of losing their foot soldiers. They need an army to win elections, an unthinking army that would take their word on faith alone. Aha, who forms their worldview based on faith alone? Religious folks. Target acquired. When Roe was first decided, evangelical Christian leaders did not even object. It took them 5 years before Paul Weyrich figured out the Republicans could use that issue to get religious voters to vote unquestioningly for any damn thing the GOP leaders wanted. Before they realized they could use it for electoral advantage, evangelical leaders in the Republican Party did not have a position on abortion. For 5 long years, in 1978, Weyrich ran an experiment for the Republican National Committee to use abortion as an election issue. It worked, and they won 4 local elections for Republican candidates in Iowa, New Hampshire, and Minnesota. That's when they realized they should pretend to care about the issue. If you think about it, abortion was the original QAnon-like conspiracy. These days, QAnon says that you have to vote against Democrats because they are child molesters. Now, as absurd as that sounds to any rational person, followers believe it with all their hearts. They actually believe that children are in mortal danger and they have to protect them. What would you do if you truly believed that? Pause to think about it. If I thought children were actually being molested and murdered, There is not anything I would not do to stop it. Now you know why QAnon adherents are radicalized. What would be too radical to do to save children from molestation and murder? If you think yes, well, that might be a small sliver of the Republican Party, but not a big enough contingent to be politically relevant, you are disastrously wrong. As of 2022, 25% of the Republican Party believes that the government, media, and financial worlds in the US are controlled by a group of Satan-worshipping pedophiles who run a global child sex trafficking operation. I know, it's unbelievable, but it's true. Overall, 16% of all Americans believe this insane theory. That's over 50 million people. But it gets worse. An even bigger number, 28% of Republicans say that there's a storm coming that is going to wipe away the elites and restore the rightful leaders. That sounds crazy. Who are the rightful leaders? And who designated them that? And what do they mean by a storm that wipes people away? Well, don't worry. They get more specific. The same 28% of Republicans say that because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. You did not read that wrong, and it is an exact quote. These are the questions that were asked verbatim in a Public Religion Research Institute and the Interfaith Youth Corps poll done in May 2021. Yes, nearly 3 in 10 Republican voters think it might be time to resort to violence because they are worried that the Democrats are Satan-worshipping pedophiles. And it's true. Like, I used to think it was ridiculous too, but even people that I was kind of aligned with, friends, they fell for this stuff. So don't think like, oh, I don't want to be friends with those people anyways, because a lot of these people are they're not bad people. They have a lot of, they're just like pessimistic, and they think they've been sold this lie, like I said, with all the money that's put towards brainwashing, like propaganda, like Rumble, for example. But wait, it gets worse. It always does. Another 55% of Republican voters were not sure. To be fair, they mostly disagreed with those statements, but they did not completely disagree. Which part was the accurate part? I'm afraid to ask. The pedophile ring, the Satan worshiping, or the harvesting of children's blood? Oh yeah, they also believe that. There is a QAnon conspiracy that the elites harvest the adrenaline that is present in the blood of frightened children. To be specific, they believe a video exists of Hillary Clinton and her top aide wearing the mask of a dead child's face as they drink the child's harvested blood. What would you do if you thought the other side was molesting children and then drinking their blood? Well, you might be confused because it'd be the first time you'd ever heard of such a thing, so it would be hard to have a rational reaction. But seriously, what would you not do if you thought some people were doing child sacrifices? What wouldn't you do to save those children? This is a trick as old as time. It's called blood libel, and it has been used to drum up anti-Semitism for thousands of years. People who wanted to attack Jews would convince the faithful that the Jewish people were kidnapping Christian children and drinking their blood. The minute people believe that, they are hooked forever. Those people are weaponized as the most hardcore political participants. Who cares about trade policy or infrastructure bills if the other side is kidnapping and raping children? Now do you see how powerful this is? That's also exactly what the Republican Party leaders did with abortion. They convinced religious voters to be Republicans because Democrats were murdering children. Republican voters have been letting the rich rob them for decades because they thought they were saving innocent children from being murdered. That's exactly what pro-life advocates believe. Why did you think they were so angry and radical? It's the same exact idea as QAnon. What wouldn't you do to save babies from certain death? But in the case of abortion, it was not just a bunch of lunatics online that dreamed this up. It was guys in suits, and they did it so they could rob you more effectively. Wait a minute, isn't there at least truth to the Bible being against abortion? I hope you're sitting. No, there is no truth to it. It's made up. The Bible is actually pro-abortion. I know this is a tough pill to swallow. This is where I almost lose you. Come on, Cenk. You challenged a lot of our orthodoxies and you had some interesting facts to back you up, but not this one. This is one of the bedrocks of American politics. Are you saying the entire country got it wrong? And all the religious leaders as well? Yes, that is what I'm saying. and I'm about to prove it. Let's go to the Bible and find out who was right. Actually, let me do a magic trick. Let me insert this a passage in the Bible that will prove me right. It'll be a passage where God clearly calls for an abortion and a priest performs it. Well, there's no way in the world that that's in the Bible, so this will have to be the best magic trick you've ever seen. I'll call it Numbers 5:11 to 31. You know, I think I'm gonna do a video on this topic separately, just so you know, this video is just not like just a bunch of blabbering, because I do have a point, and my point is that the Southern strategy was designed to. It's one of the worst things that's ever happened in exacerbating the division in the South, for example, and making good America. I grew up in the South, so I love the South. I love the niceness and like good people. I've seen so many good people just like be deluded by the wrong thing, and that's why it's important to point this out. Another example I can read right here. He's talking about crooks. But we have not reached the worst part yet. Wait, how could anything be worse than a deeply racist party or maniacal liars who trick people of faith to rob them of their money and votes? It's why they do it and who they serve. Republican politicians are masterful at psychological phenomenon called projection. Whatever they are doing behind the scenes, they project it into their opponents. Normally, this is part of the human psychology is subconscious. With Republicans, it is not. It is done on purpose for a very good reason. If you attack first with what is actually your number one problem, when the other side counterattacks it, it'll look defensive and they'll look guilty. So that's why Republicans are always saying that the Democrats are controlled behind the scenes by secret donors like George Soros, because that's exactly who they're controlled by, secret donors behind the scenes. Now, the GOP probably didn't expect to get this lucky. The craven Democratic leadership never even bothered to counterattack. So if you ask most Americans which party is more elitist, Democrats would probably lose that fight. And to be fair to the American people, the Democrats are kind of elitists and are controlled by donors. But to be fair to the truth, the Republicans are even worse. George Soros has nothing on the Koch brothers, the late Sheldon Adelson, or the Mercer family. These guys give away way more to the Republicans than Soros does to Democrats. I would definitely take all their money out of politics, including Soros. Otherwise, we don't have a democracy, we have an auction. But if anyone tells you how bad Soros is, ask them if they want to end private financing of our elections to stop that awful problem. If they're an average Republican voter, they will agree. But if they're a Republican politician, they'll never agree in 1,000 years. They love the system that brought you George Soros. They wouldn't change it if their political lives depended on it, because they do. They'd never win another election if we ended private financing of elections. The whole party is built on corruption, which brings us to a fun and important question. Who are worse, Republican voters or Republican politicians? In the Republican Party, there are two different sets of people, the voters and the politicians. As you might have discovered, I'm not within 1,000 miles of politically correct, so I don't mind telling you that they're both awful, but they're awful for different reasons. What do the voters want? That's really easy, because they just told you with their votes. In the 2016 presidential primaries, they had 17 different Republicans to choose from. They could have picked the pure conservative firebrand, Ted Cruz, or the most efficient conservative bureaucrat, John Kasich. They could have voted for the patrician, Jeb Bush, or the young, dynamic conservative, Marco Rubio, etc. No, they decided to vote for the ugliest, loudest, most bigoted son of a bitch they could find. Trump's hateful rhetoric, like his lies, was not the bug for the Republican voters, it was the feature. When he went after the squad, the four young progressive women in Congress, AOC, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, and Rashida Tlaib, all Justice Democrats, and said they should go back to their countries, he gained 5 points among Republican voters. By the way, those women, the squad, they're the only ones that started, like, with what's going on right now, to ask for a ceasefire. And it bothers me that they're not getting the attention for that, because a lot of people are all of a sudden, very pro-Palestine and want a ceasefire, but I feel like there's like a stigma associated with giving credit where it's due or something. I don't know, because the Republican Party's brainwashed people so much. But those are the people, the squad is asking for a ceasefire at this point, and they're being attacked like by the Republicans unilaterally. Okay, so let me go back to where I was and said they should go back to their countries. Yeah, so Trump gained 5 points when he told them to go back to their countries. Trump consistently maintains the support of 90% of Republicans. He got 93% of their vote in 2020. Voters have had plenty of opportunity to see what a lying, vain, xenophobic scam artist he is. Since the media were in love with the Republican voters with their incessant refrain that this is a center-right country, they thought that those wonderful, decent voters who represent real Americans would reject Trump in 2020. But they did not. They loved him. They were here for it. In fact, now many of them won't listen to anyone but Trump. Remember, Trump is a lifelong con artist. If GOP voters had wanted a kind and gentle Republican, that's what he would have pretended to be. He became more and more vicious in his racism and cruelty because he sensed that's what his base wanted, and he was right. So it's not that Republicans are now more hateful because of Trump. In a sense, Trump is more hateful because of Republican voters. Like a good performer, he's giving the crowd what they want. In fact, Sam Nunberg, one of his closest advisors, explained how Trump used him to figure out what conservative voters most desired. Nunberg explained, "I listened to thousands of hours of talk radio, and he was getting reports from me. When I started putting him on conservative talk radio in 2013, Mark Levin's show and guys like that, they kept asking him about immigration. That was our focus group. Every time Trump tweeted against amnesty in 2013, 2014, he would get hundreds and hundreds of retweets. This is what digital media professionals would call A/B testing. You try A and see if it works. And if it doesn't, you move on to B and test that. Well, Trump tested bigotry and it tested through the roof. Nunberg told reporter Joshua Green that it was intuitive by him to use immigration as a new wedge issue. Remember that a wedge issue is something used by politicians to divide us based on identity politics. So Trump tested his racism methodically and chose the more hateful approach because it was getting a better response from Republican voters. This is who conservatives are, and this is what they believe. Their actions and their votes, not the words of their pundits, reveal what conservatives actually want. If you stroll through bookstores in DC, you can find a whole shelf of tomies with titles like The Conservative Sensibility and Conservatism, an invitation to the great tradition. The ideas in them bear only a passing resemblance to what conservatives actually do in practice. Sometimes right-wing intellectuals and upper-level party flunkies like to imagine that they're part of some highbrow, sober, bow-tied tradition that dates back to Edmund Burke. That's hilarious. The guy they just voted for said we should inject disinfectant into our bodies to cure COVID. He thought it might have been a good idea to nuke a hurricane. He thought passing a dementia test meant that he was a very stable genius. Highbrow, intellectual conservatism? Come on, that's hysterical. There's no such thing among Republican voters. Remember all those television segments where pundits would tell you that Republican voters wanted policies like free trade and deregulation of the banking industry? They were just making that up out of the whole cloth. There was never any poll that showed that. If you told an average Republican voter that he was in favor of free trade first, he would ask you what that is, because in reality, he has no idea. Does he really know that means outsourcing his own job? And then once you explain to him what free trade actually means, he would tell you he hates it. And lo and behold, Trump came out against free trade. And the Republican voters loved him for it. The corporate media were lying to you the whole time. They were just telling you what they wanted and pretending that Republican voters wanted it. Now, after all this, you might be surprised that I think Republican politicians are even worse than their voters. Why? Because at least what's described here is the real unvarnished truth of the voters. In a democracy in a giant, diverse country, you're not going to have an electorate of angels. You have to debate, cajole, convince, and defeat the other side. I think there are good guys and bad guys, but at least they're all real. And that's how democracy works. We have to work with the electorate we have, not the one we wish we had. And at least Republican voters have progressive economic instincts, even if they don't know it. They also distrust the establishment and are rooting for the average American worker. in their own way. I can work with that. I'll fight their demons and look for their better angels. If you look super hard, you might even find them. That's not the case for elected Republican officials. At the national level, they have absolutely no redeeming qualities. Unfortunately, Republican politicians don't even believe in democracy. That was true even before they tried to literally end democracy in 2020. They are craven, callous followers of the donor class. They're glorified water boys for the rich who will do anything they are ordered to do, no matter how corrupt and harmful to the country and the world. A first of its kind study published in March 2019 by Harvard Law School uses Federal Election Commission records to compile a database of all the political contributions made by over 3,500 CEOs and S&P 1500 companies from 2000 to 2017. The study found that Republicans received twice as many contributions from CEOs as Democrats did. So there was a study, 17-year study, to see which party got more donor money, and Republicans received twice as much contributions from CEOs as Democrats did. That's a big difference, and this is why the Democrat Party has its own problems, but it's not funded. It's wrong to say both parties are the same. More than 90% of CEOs of energy companies donated heavily to Republicans. Gee, I wonder why Republicans deny climate change. So what do Republican politicians believe in? Protecting privilege. That's it. That's what modern conservatism is about. According to the political theorist Corey Robin in his book, The Reactionary Mind, that's what conservatism has always been about, since Burke's days. Keeping the lower orders in check so that their social betters can continue ruling and amassing privileges. That is what conservatism is, a meditation on and theoretical rendition of the felt experience of having power, seeing it threatened, and trying to win it back, writes Robin. Historically, the conservative has favored liberty for the higher orders and constraint for the lower orders. This explains why the Republican Party promotes itself as devoted to small government, even as it pushes policies that are about massive government intrusion in people's lives. Mass incarceration, the state taking control of women's bodies when they're pregnant. State taking control of women's bodies when they're pregnant. State-mandated discrimination against members of the LGBTQ community, and a gluttonous military that gorges on endless wars. None of that is anywhere near small government. They want big government for you, but small government for themselves. To the rest of us, that might look hypocritical, but it does not to them. They want power, period. So using the government to restrain the others and then having the government back off when it comes to them is consistent. They want the power either way. They couldn't care less about the conservative movement's intellectual foundations. There are no ideological conservative principles other than those in the imagination of a handful of Republican intellectuals in DC. It's a Frankenstein party stitched together from the resentful, the willfully uninformed, and the greedy. In the end, I'll take the Republican voters over their politicians because at least they're honest. They hate you from the front and don't hide their intentions. Plus, they also hate corruption. As awful as the right wing can be, they're still leagues above the people claiming to represent them but secretly working for the elites. Center-right myth. So why don't Democrats fight back more aggressively against the GOP? If I'm right about how radical the GOP is, because they have also bought into the mythology that we're a center-right country. It's maddening because it leads to unilateral surrender on what is actually winning ground for us. There's a ton of research showing that politicians in the mainstream media consistently overstate the conservatism of the American electorate. In 2018, 3 political scientists from Columbia University and the University of California at Santa Barbara, Alexander Hertel Fernandez, Matto Mildenberger, and Leah Stokes, asked the most senior staff members in Congress to judge what the public in their district or state believed when it came to 5 hot-button issues: repealing Obamacare, raising the minimum wage, requiring background checks on gun sales, regulating carbon dioxide, and investing $300 billion in infrastructure projects. The academics then compared the responses with the large public opinion surveys to determine what the public actually wanted. The senior staffers are the ones who write bills, prepare hearings, and organize the schedule of their bosses. That is, they are the people who actually do the work in Congress. If anyone in the country is attuned to public opinion, it should be these folks. That wasn't the case. It wasn't even close. Across the board, we found that congressional aides are wildly inaccurate in their perceptions of their constituents' opinions and preferences, the political scientists determined. On all 5 issues they were asked about, the senior staff member in Congress believed that their voters were far, far more conservative than they actually were. For instance, 92% of the staffers underestimated support in their state or district for background checks for gun purchases. Every single Republican 100% believed that voters would be more likely to oppose these common sense gun control measures. Maybe that shouldn't be a surprise. Republicans long ago sold their souls to the NRA. They had to buy into the idea that people don't want any gun control so they could sleep at night. But 85% of Democratic aides also underestimated how much their voters wanted background checks. Remember that the next time your crazy Fox News watching uncle tells you how congressional Democrats are far left zealots. It turns out even these allegedly Antifa-loving Democrats are way more conservative in their assumptions than the average voter. Think about how amazing that is. The average American voter thinks that Republicans are wrong on almost every issue, but the Democrats disagree. They think Republicans are more popular than they are. Wow. Now can you begin to see why progressives might have a huge advantage on the issues and lose elections anyway? The most incompetent, self-defeating people in the country have been put in charge of the Democratic Party. Of course you'll lose if you think you're going to lose before the game even starts. The same trio of researchers then looked at why Washington aides were so far off when it came to guessing public opinion. The first reason they came up with was the staffers' own right-wing-leaning beliefs. Aides usually assumed that the public agreed with their own policy views. The academics wrote in the Times summarizing their research. Since people working in Congress have relatively conservative beliefs, staffers assume that voters back home do too. Nope. The other reason why staff members overestimated public conservatism was interest groups. Aides who reported meetings with groups representing big business like the United States Chamber of Commerce or the American Petroleum Institute were more likely to get their constituents' opinions wrong compared with staffers who reported meeting with mass membership groups that represented ordinary Americans like the Sierra Club, or labor unions. The political scientists determined, and who do you think aides meet more with? Representatives from big business or from the environmental groups? Chamber of Commerce or the Sierra Club? Here's a hint. It's the one with a gazillion dollars to spend bankrolling politicians, not the group trying to save the caribou. Yes, they actually convinced themselves that the American Petroleum Institute really knows what the American people want and has the best interests of American citizens in mind. No one can be that stupid, it turns out they're not. They're basically being paid to have that position. It wasn't just meetings that fueled the problem. The same pattern holds for campaign contributions. The more that offices get support from fossil fuel companies over environmental groups, the more they underestimate state or district level support for climate action. As we showed you earlier, Congress members get a lot of financial support from fossil fuel companies, and lo and behold, they're convinced everyone loves dirty energy. Conducting good polling actually costs money and takes time. Since most congressional offices cannot regularly field public opinion surveys of their constituents, the political scientists explained, staff members depend heavily on meeting and relationship with interest groups to piece together a picture of what their constituents want. And if offices hear from only deep-pocketed interest groups, they are likely to miss out on the opinions of ordinary Americans. That's exactly what's happening. This research built on other studies that reached similar conclusions, except that earlier research had shown that political elites everywhere in the country thought their voters were more right-wing than was true. In other words, this is a problem that exists far beyond Washington. In a study published in 2018 in the American Political Science Review, 2 political scientists at Northwestern University and Stanford University, David Brookman and Christopher Skovron, surveyed 1858 state legislative politicians. They looked at both incumbents and candidates, those in power and people running for office, and then they compared the results to data on public opinion from the Cooperative Congressional Election Study. What do you think they found? They found the state politicians believed that support for conservative positions on these issues in their constituencies was much higher than it actually was. These misperceptions are large, pervasive, and robust. Of course, large, pervasive, robust. Those three words succinctly describe the levels of wrongness of policymakers around the country. Again, Democrats were part of the problem. They too believed that their voters were more right-wing than was actually the case. Their mental software was also rewritten to believe the myth that we are a right-wing country. Democrats and Republicans both overestimate their constituents' conservatism on every single issue, with the one exception that Democrats very slightly underestimate support for the conservative birth control religious exemptions policy, the authors of the study found. Here's another reason why basically, just reading that much so far of this great book, you can kind of see, and I appreciate if you're still with me here, and you know, I don't know if I should continue reading this whole thing because I don't want to be boring, and I want to get the point across. Although, you know, we'll see, like with these other chapters, if I want to do some reading so people are educated, because my point is a lot of people just don't know, and that's just how the system, the matrix, was designed. So I think a lot of people are finding things out now with the eclipse season, and there's going to be more revelations, but I think it's important to share these like actual facts about things happening with like our community as a whole. And of course, right now, with all the craziness going on, like my heart goes out to all the victims on both the Israeli and Palestinian side. And I think that's also kind of showing, because 4 out of 5 Israeli citizens are against Netanyahu, because with all the money that they have from us giving them money, like Netanyahu had no excuse for that Hamas attack to happen, but his sights were elsewhere. He was more focused on globalism, or like ruling more of the area, you know, right-wing extremist stuff. And that's why, you know, I think all this is going to lead up to this Pluto and Aquarius, where we all have the knowledge and the self-agency, and, you know, these people at the top are toppled, kind of. So share what you want in the comments. You know, I'll try my best to respond to them, like, honestly. And even if you're like on the other side and want to tell me something, I just think we all need to kind of stick together right now, because there's a lot of like darkness in the world. So thanks again for listening to that much. And I'll think of some more points to make as I read the rest of this great book. Like, for example, there's a section on why Donald Trump was so popular, because and that's what I dislike Trump even more, because he actually had the opportunity to like be a populist and do some of the great things he said he would do in 2016, but he never did. So, I mean, his administration was the swampiest of the swamp monsters as can be. So, like, you know, and there's actual policies that were so detrimental to us, like the you know, destroying the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. There's so many disasters he did, but like no one ever talks about those things, because no one knows about those things. And that's why it's important that we talk about these things and exposing like these bad actors. But thanks again for listening, and please like and subscribe and share with your friends. And I wish you all the best during this time of eclipse season.